Willful Virgin, Essays in Feminism by Marilyn Frye, Part 2, 4 reviews. Essay number 7, Feminism and the New Physics. A review of The Anatomy of Freedom, Feminism, Physics, and Global Politics by Robin Morgan, 1982. Like most of Robin Morgan's writings, this book is intensely autobiographical and deliberately provocative of personal response. I like the personal, the poetic, and the theoretical being intermixed. I like an author's being strongly present in her work. But in this case, I think it is wise to hold back and refuse her invitation to personal involvement, for the invitation is at best ambivalent. For instance, she introduces a guided tour of her own body images as an engagement to intense and complete that quote unquote, you might not emerge from here unborn. But only a few sentences later, she warns the reader off. Quote, you can neither find nor lose yourself here. I'm much too crowded already. End quote. At worst, she will make a patsy of you. She covers her gratuitous admission that her husband wrote some passages of the book by claiming everyone else's collaboration too. Quote, you, too, have written certain passages in this book when you thought you were merely playing. Do you know which passages? End quote. This is coercive, co-optive, and condescending, not to mention cute. My second reason for resisting the personal engagement Morgan would seduce the reader into is that I think she is importantly and fundamentally wrong in this book, and that should be said from a respectful distance. Robin Morgan has paid a lot of dues. She had a significant part in the new articulation of feminism that burst upon America in the middle of the late 60s. She stumped the states, stirring up the new women's liberation movement. She has demonstrated, petitioned, occupied, speechified, written poetry, read poetry, marched, and been arrested. Many feminists in these early 80s were indebted to her, often in ways we do not even know, intellectually, artistically, and for wholesome examples of darkness and brashness. The Anatomy of Freedom is meant to make that same kind of contribution, a leadership and inspiration, to the second generation of this movement. The book covers a lot of ground. She talks of images of the self, dream selves, body images, old and young selves. She mixes and connects her topics nicely, joining, for example, quote unquote, the American family, international feminist networking, and American racism in a chapter subtitled, quote unquote, An Anatomy of Kin. The chapter subtitled, quote unquote, An Anatomy of Mortality is about children and the meaning of old age. Chapter 4, on sexual passion, includes a very interesting discussion of desire as curiosity and quote unquote sexual fundamentalism as the effort out of fear to suppress curiosity, and hence also intelligence. It also has a section titled quote unquote remedial living, which is about an affair she had with a virile young man whom she apparently neither respected nor liked very much. There is a long chapter on technology and women's position with respect to it, and or in fear of it. The last quarter of the book is explicitly about physics and feminism. It is the importing of ideas from physics, the so-called quote-unquote new physics, that Morgan sees as bringing something fresh and hopeful to her revision and re-articulation of feminism. She has been sparked by the metaphors the physicists use, and she exploits the history of physics for examples of radical reconceptualization to which she can point when explaining that feminism generates and requires reconstruction of one's worldview. I agree that the conceptual shifts from classical mechanics to quantum physics are useful analogues of the shifts of consciousness feminism involves. Beyond that, her connecting of physics and feminisms seems to me both forced and a great mistake. Morgan's theorizing does not connect firmly, not always intelligibly, with the concepts and theories of physics or with its uses of its language. For instance, she says, quote, let's call our framework the F-matrix theory, equating as F equals ET squared, or feminism equals equality slash empowerment slash evolution times the squared velocity of transformation, end quote. This use of F equals ET squared is so remote from any use of equations in physics as to make importing such a pattern of symbols into this context seem to be merely a gimmick. Equations are not slogans, and slogans, which have their own perfectly respectable powers, do not acquire either the prestige or the empirical meaning of scientific generalizations by being expressed in the format of equations. By my reading, there is throughout the book a great deal of this sort of adventitious use of the verbal and conceptual apparatus of physics, while I find the use of it only rarely illuminating. Morgan trusts physics and physicists. She quotes from the book warmly and with confidence. The books. Warmly and with confidence. She begins one section with the incautious phrase, quote, "The new physics has taught us," end quote. Her physicists are probably right about physics, though they will be displeased too in a while by a fresh crop of newer physicists. But their imaginations and metaphors have been shaped within an intellectual establishment which is one of the most persistently male-dominated and elitist of them all, and they are engaged in popularizing their knowledge and themselves, which is not and could not be a politically innocent undertaking. Listen to them in their own words and in Morgan's paraphrases of them. Quote, "Mass doesn't exist per se. Mass is merely a form of energy." Quote, "Energy itself, which is all there is." Quote, "The solid material body is an illusion. It is all a matter of energy." Quote, "Quantum theory has demolished the classical concepts of solid objects." Quote, "Mass is simply a form of energy." Quote, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." Quote, "Everything is energy." And in this list of descriptions of beliefs, which are said to be obsolete, quote, "Material and matter are seen as real," end quote. The mathematical relationship of energy and mass could be interpreted to mean that mass and energy are equally different modes of being of the same ultimate quote-unquote stuff. But this rhetoric translates the mathematics into a hierarchical, one-way reductive identification. Matter is really energy. And the fact that quantum physics does not make use of the concept of matter that is employed in classical mechanics is given over as matter is not real, the solid material body is an illusion. Morgan quotes one scientist as saying, quote, "All of astrophysics is about nature's attempt to release the energy in matter," end quote. Listen to the language. Nature is featured as an agent with a will and a purpose, the purpose being to transform matter into energy, a transformation which leaves no matter. Accordingly, the quote-unquote natural progress of the universe is toward a world without matter. Matter is conceived as something whose natural destiny is to be annihilated. In the rhetoric of the new physics, matter is something illusory, temporary, static, cosmically primitive. In this new Pythagoreanism, all is energy. Throughout Morgan's book, energy is associated with motion, freedom, and joy, while matter is associated with stasis, rigidity, confinement, and oppression. There is nothing new about this. This is Plato. This is Christianity. This is spirit-body dualism. This is misogyny. Matter, body, flesh, woman. The rhetoric and imagery of the so-called new physics, as popularized in a recent flood of fashionable books, is the same old stuff passed off as new and optimistic, playful science. It makes me dizzy to see someone like Robin Morgan thinking it might be a vehicle for a new, optimistic, and joyful feminism. Though she is a poet, no mean scholar of misogyny, and a conscious rebel against body loathing, Morgan apparently did not hear these scary mythic meanings of the rhetoric in the popularized physics. I think this may be because her interest in physics was not, after all, primarily a poet's attraction to metaphors. It really is the physics, not the language, that she had an important use for. This comes out in the chapter on marriage. The chapter on marriage is about her own marriage and is as central to this book as marriage is to patriarchy. Though she gives reasons for using the word marriage, she insists that she is, quote, not speaking about the institution of marriage, end quote, but about, quote, the complex holography involved in any two persons of any sex living together as sexual lovers and in a more or less long term emotional bond of partnership, which can include economic, social, aesthetic, political, etc., sharing of resources, end quote. When the quote unquote persons of any sex are in fact a woman and a man who are legally married, this distinction does not hold up, and Morgan herself points to many of the reasons why it cannot. In her discussion of children and sex, she is very clear on the point that power differences between two people inescapably keep quote unquote partnership from being simple partnership. Quote, when somebody much older, taller, or physically stronger is involved, when it's less a question of sex than of power, and when an imbalance of power is going on in a sexual relationship, we ought to know by now how deeply destructive that is, end quote. She says her husband is significantly older than she. Given what she says about her own stature, he is probably taller and physically stronger than she. And as a white male and a legal husband, he certainly has more social and economic power than she. She also cites articles and quotes which draw attention to the fact that a marriage contract creates a legal relationship frighteningly like that of chattel slavery. In spite of her efforts not to treat this marriage as a marriage, as in quote unquote the institution of marriage, she must know it is one. In fact, this chapter reads as a history of the struggle to make a marriage into a partnership, and it expresses perhaps more effectively than she would wish a longing, almost a craving, for the reconciliation which has not been achieved. As she says in the first chapter, the struggle is not yet even a struggle for freedom, but still, so far, only for the bare idea of freedom. And it is physics which she thinks can provide an analogy which will make liberation from marriage, man and woman, and the reconciliation of quote unquote sexless, ageless, raceless brains and hearts, end quote, conceivable. Quote, quantum physics shattered two basic assumptions of classical science, causality and determinism, and opened up the internal microcosmic universe. If a higher magnification on the seemingly solid body of the marriage can be managed, then the solid, fixed, intransigent form will disappear via the examination. At a higher magnification still, the particles reveal themselves as reconstitutable wholes, each with its own inviolable integrity. No matter how they have seemed to merge, seem to affirm or resent the merging. End quote. According to physics, rigidity, stasis, closure, fixedness are all, as a matter of good sound science, appearances, bound to and dependent on particular circumstances of observation. Nothing at all remains constant through the variations and circumstances of observation. Riding the analogy, the merger, the marriage, the intransigent, fixed, solid structure is a seeming thing, its immutability an illusion, a mere appearance dependent upon the position and situation of the observer. We traveled the slogan, quote unquote, the personal is political, out to where we could grasp the bars of our cages, the rigid and unyielding structures of material and ideological force, which are the causes that determine so much of what we do and what happens to us. Many women thought those structures could be changed in our time by goodwill, good sex, good analysis, and good organizing. And perhaps our individual and joint efforts have changed them slightly here and there. But generally, they have proven intransigent indeed. And the deep weariness, the frustration, the great hunger of the tired revolutionaries are taking their toll. With a surge of desperate hope, Morgan reverses the slogan to travel back to the quote unquote internal microcosmic universe, thinking that a change of focus will prove that the solidity of the bars of this cage, like the solidity of matter, was mere appearance, mere illusion, dependent on the situation of the observer. It doesn't work. A woman's body and a man's fist are exactly as fragile and as solid as they are. The principles of classical mechanics still describe the behavior of middle sized objects, even when they are understood as a special subset of the principles of the new physics. And anyway, no matter the progress of physics, a broken nose is a broken nose is a broken nose. The fixedness, durability, and rigidity of the institutions which shape and determine the adversarial oppositions of women and men are not illusory. It is not true what Morgan suggests in the first chapter and tries to believe in the fifth, that unfreedom is an illusion. It cannot be cured by an active imagination, at least not by this one. The buoyant and buoying optimism of Morgan's belief that she has found a way to reconciliation will be tremendously attractive to many feminist readers, for whom a good dose of optimism is much needed these days. But the energy of the work is in some part due to a discordant tension between Morgan's vision of salvation and her own solid knowledge of the simple, mundane, perversely non biodegradable reality of the oppression of women by men. The tension is often hard to recognize because she veils, disguises, and sometimes disowns that knowledge. The author of this book no longer affirms all her transformations. It was in her poem, The Network of the Imaginary Mother, that Robin Morgan said, quote, I disown none of my transformations. I affirm all of my transformations, end quote. Lady of the Beast, 1976. In The Anatomy of Freedom, she systematically disowns both her former selves and her selves in other women. She mentions her own participation in the radical thinking of the late 60s, most often only to say that she has outgrown and transcended such thought. For example, quote, there we were, feministically aware of the problem, sexism, and able to exchange grown up names for how it worked objectification, socialization, commercialization, internalization, and various other Asians. End quote. In general, she speaks with trivializing condescension of those selves, hers and ours, who really took feminist politics seriously, who took seriously, for instance, the idea that appearance and costume have political meaning, and thus cut our hair, stopped shaving our legs, stopped wearing high heeled shoes. She has special contempt for the selves, including her own, who explored or tried to explore lesbian love when it seemed not so much physically compelling as a logically compelling outcome of honestly and consistently held feminist politics. In this case and in others, she trivializes women and women's actions by describing feminists' adventures and experiments as capitulations to political pressure rather than as conscientiousness, and sometimes more exciting and beneficial attempts to synthesize political thought and personal action. And you would never know from Morgan that some of the experiments with lesbians' love were fueled by lively physical desire. Her world is littered with women she pointedly disowns. Women who have taken one or another feminist idea and, by Morgan's lights, gone too far. Quote unquote, extremist matriarchists, goddess worshippers, biological determinists, quote unquote, earth mothers, non monogamists, women who play the men's game, separatists, quote unquote, self styled radical feminists, and so on and so on. Morgan's most hostile dissociation from other women is from women who believe that S&M and or pornography are defensible. Having characterized quote-unquote sexual fundamentalists as, among other things, people who see sexual practices other than their own as quote-unquote sick, Morgan herself characterizes women who defend S&M or pornography as quote-unquote damaged, and tells the rest of us we certainly should move quote-unquote beyond taking them seriously. She is sure, quote, such women can realize that what they, in their piteously twisted sexuality, are upholding has nothing to do with feminist vision of freedom, end quote. With this decisive amputation, Morgan destroys any usefulness her ideas about sexual fundamentalism, sexual energy, and sexual violence might have had in the perplexing controversies about S&M, and pornography. If any of the apparently immutable structures which trap us are illusory and escapable by acts of imagination, it might be some of those which alienate women from ourselves and each other. But the reconciliation for which Morgan yearns is not that one. It is women's and men's alienation from each other that torments her. The Anatomy of Freedom is, profoundly, a book for the consolation of heterosexual feminist people. It is certainly strong enough that many will be invigorated by its enthusiasms, but I cannot see that it could change their lives. Robin Morgan herself, I think, will not be consoled. The great tension in this book suggests that the rash and willful girl child at the center of her will finally settle for nothing less than the dance and the revolution.